Amir got the call on a Tuesday. Tunde got his on a Thursday of the same week. Different managers, different departments, same company, and for the first time in either of their careers, raises that actually felt like something. 23%. The kind of number that makes you sit quietly for a moment before you tell your family. That was 9 years ago. Tunde stopped working last year at 41, by choice. Amir is still at his desk, still capable, still well regarded. But the raise that was supposed to change his life mostly changed his furniture. Same company, same year, same number, completely different lives. And the reason has nothing to do with investment strategy or market knowledge or some advantage one had over the other. It has to do with a psychological mechanism so ordinary, so invisible, so perfectly disguised as good judgment that most people never see it working until it is already finished. Hi, I'm Buck. And today we're going to rethink how money really works. If you've ever earned more and somehow ended up feeling less free, you're exactly where this conversation is meant to find you. Let's start with Amir, because his story is the one most people are actually living. Amir grew up in Pune. His family wasn't poor, but money was counted carefully. You bought what you needed. You maintained what you had. And you didn't spend in ways that invited comment. There was a phrase his father used that translated roughly as, "Don't let your outside grow faster than your inside." Amir understood it as a child. He forgot it as an adult. When the raise arrived, Amir did something entirely reasonable. He moved to a better apartment. The old one was fine, objectively fine, but the new salary made the old walls feel slightly insufficient. A step up made sense. He could afford it now, and he had earned it. Then, inside the new apartment, the old sofa looked out of place. Not dramatically wrong, just inconsistent, so he bought a better one. Not extravagant, tasteful. Then, the sofa made the coffee table look wrong. The coffee table was replaced. The new coffee table revealed that the rug beneath it was tired, slightly shabby in a way Head never noticed before. The rug went too. By the time the living room felt coherent, complete, the way a room is supposed to feel, he had spent more than 3 months of his raise without buying a single thing that felt like a luxury at the time. Each decision was reasonable. Each one was caused by the one before it. This has a name. The French philosopher Denis Diderot described it in 1769. After being gifted a beautiful scarlet dressing gown that made everything else in his study feel inadequate by comparison, he called it a strange discomfort. We now call it the Diderot effect, the tendency for one acquisition to create a cascade of related acquisitions, each entirely logical, each pulled forward by the last, until the original purchase has quietly seeded an entirely new standard of living. Diderot wrote about it with remarkable self-awareness. He went from being master of his home to a slave to a dressing gown. He meant it partly as satire, but it is also a precise description of what happens to most people in the months after a raise arrives. The raise doesn't just raise your income, it raises the context your life exists inside. And once the context shifts, everything within it has to either rise to meet it or be replaced. Not out of greed, out of coherence. The human mind finds inconsistency uncomfortable. And an expensive apartment containing a worn rug is an inconsistency the mind quietly insists on resolving. Amir never made a reckless decision. He made dozens of coherent ones. The cascade carried him forward, purchase by purchase, until the raise had been fully absorbed into a life that now required every penny of it. Tunde's story starts in the same place and arrives somewhere entirely different, but not because he was more disciplined, or more informed, or more willing to sacrifice comfort. He was lucky in one specific way. He saw the mechanism coming. Tun grew up in Lagos, the second of 4 children, in a household where the pressure to appear stable was constant and real. He had watched his father spend in ways that announced prosperity before prosperity had actually arrived. A car that couldn't be maintained, a house that stretched the family thin, school fees that required borrowing every second term. His father was a proud man and a generous one. Those qualities had costs that the family was still calculating when Tun left for university. He loved his father. He also paid close attention. When his own raise arrived, Tunde did something that surprised his wife. He asked to wait. Not to celebrate, not to decide anything, just to wait 60 days. He wanted to observe what the new number felt like before he let it reshape anything. He called it a quarantine period. He treated the additional income as though it didn't exist yet and watched himself carefully to see where the pressure would come from. What he noticed surprised him. The pressure wasn't coming from inside. It was coming from beside him. This is where the story turns. Because the force driving Amir's cascade of purchases wasn't really the sofa, or the apartment, or even the raise itself. It was the people around him, and the invisible social architecture they were all living inside together. Leon Festinger, a social psychologist working in the 1950s, proposed that human beings have a fundamental drive to evaluate their standing, their abilities, their opinions, their material circumstances. By comparing themselves to others they consider roughly similar, not to billionaires. The gap is too wide to feel personal, to colleagues, to peers, to the person at the same stage of life, earning in the same rough range, navigating the same kinds of decisions. What makes this particularly difficult is that the comparisons aren't conscious. Nobody sits down and thinks, "My colleague just bought a newer car, therefore I should upgrade mine." The process is far quieter than that. It operates through mood, through a vague sense of dissatisfaction with things that were fine last month, through the feeling, which arrives without a clear source, that the life you have is slightly behind the life you're supposed to have by now. Festinger called this social comparison theory. And in a workplace where multiple people receive raises in the same year, it doesn't stay theoretical for long. Amir's colleagues were buying things, not showing off, just living. A different car in the car park that he noticed once, then twice. A conversation about a holiday with a quiet confidence underneath it. Small signals, never directed at him, that his nervous system received and translated without his conscious awareness into a single recurring message. You should be further along than this. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't even aware, most of the time, that comparison was operating, but it was setting the floor beneath every decision he made, quietly defining what normal looked like, what adequate felt like, what he was allowed to feel satisfied with. Tunde noticed the same signals. He just noticed that he was noticing them. During his 60-day quarantine, he kept a rough log of the moments he felt the urge to spend, not the purchases themselves, but the urge and what had triggered it. Almost every entry pointed outward. A conversation, something he'd seen, a feeling of being slightly behind some invisible standard that nobody had ever formally stated. He showed the log to his wife. She added 3 entries of her own. They made a different decision, not a deprivation decision, a deliberate one. They agreed on what their life actually needed, not what it would need to stay coherent with the lives of those around them. And they built the budget from that understanding. The additional income, anything above the life they had consciously chosen, moved automatically into accounts they didn't check often. The cascade never started, because they never bought the dressing gown. Here is the reframe that changes how you see all of this. We tend to think of lifestyle creep as a spending problem, a discipline failure, a simple inability to do the math. But the math is easy. Anyone can do the math. The math is not the problem. The problem is that spending decisions aren't primarily financial decisions. They're social ones. They're identity ones. They are responses to signals from the surrounding environment that operate well below the level of deliberate thought. By the time you're standing in the furniture store making what feels like a free and rational choice, you have already been shaped by 100 small comparisons that happened without your awareness or permission. This is why budgets, on their own, so rarely change behavior over the long term. A budget assumes that if you know the right number, you'll make the right choice. But the choice isn't being made by the part of you that knows numbers. It's being made by the part of you that is constantly, invisibly, measuring where you stand relative to the people around you. You can want to save money and still overspend, not because you lack willpower, because the forces shaping the spending are operating in a register that logic doesn't easily reach. The solution isn't better mathematics, it's earlier architecture. What Tunde built during those 60 days wasn't a budget. It was a structure, a set of automatic decisions made in advance, before the pressure arrived, that removed the most dangerous choices from his daily environment entirely. He never decided month to month how much to invest. The decision was made once and ran by itself. He never saw the money. It left before it could be compared to anything, before the coherence instinct could find it and suggest a more attractive use, before Festinger's social comparison mechanism could measure it against what his colleagues were doing. Behavioral economists call this commitment architecture, the practice of making future decisions in advance, when you are calm and clear-sighted, rather than in the moment, when you are subject to every social and emotional current in the environment around you. You don't fight the mechanism, you simply remove the choice from its reach. The Diderot effect and social comparison theory work together because they both require one thing to operate: your attention, your awareness in the moment. The minute you are looking at the sofa and noticing it feels inconsistent, or overhearing a colleague's conversation and sensing you're behind, those mechanisms have already begun their work. Automation defeats them precisely because the money is gone before you look. There is nothing for the cascade to attach to. There is no inconsistency for the coherence instinct to resolve. The decision was made weeks ago by a calmer version of you, in a moment that felt entirely different from this one. Amir, 9 years later, understands all of this clearly. He is not bitter about it. He looks at his apartment, genuinely comfortable, genuinely nice, and he knows, honestly, that he has been happy in it. The sofa is good. None of it was a mistake in isolation. But isolation is not how life works. Decisions compound the way money does, except in his case, they compounded into a cost structure that now requires his salary to sustain, and a retirement that is still, depending on which numbers you use, somewhere between 6 and 8 years away. Tunde stopped working last spring. He and his wife spent 2 months in Portugal. He is consulting now, on his own terms for roughly 20 hours a week, on projects that interest him. He has no particular desire to stop working, but the desire is irrelevant. That is the entire point. He could stop. The option exists. It is real and available in a way that changes the quality of every single day, whether he exercises it or not. Freedom isn't always the choice you make. Sometimes it is simply the choice you have. There is a second cost here that almost nobody thinks to calculate. Amir is exceptional at his job. He has opinions about how things should be done that are probably correct, and he expresses them in the careful, measured way of someone who understands that being right and being heard are two separate problems. But there is a version of Amir, a slightly more willing to risk. It version, a louder version, that has never fully appeared at work. When you ask him about it in the right conversation, at the right moment, he will tell you exactly why he cannot afford to be that version right now. When your financial life requires your salary has leverage over your behavior, not dramatic leverage. Not the kind you would notice easily. The quiet kind, the kind that means you stay in the meeting longer than you should. You absorb the criticism that deserves a response. You don't take the call from the startup that reached out because the upside is uncertain, and the downside is a gap in income that the life now requires. Lifestyle creep doesn't only cost money. It doesn't only cost retirement years. It costs the version of you that could have existed if your options had remained wider. That cost never appears on a statement. It never shows up in a calculation, but it accumulates, year by year, in the decisions you didn't make and the risks you couldn't afford to take. Tunde will tell you he is not exceptional. He says the only real difference was the 60 days. 60 days of watching himself before acting. 60 days that revealed, plainly and in his own handwriting, that most of the pressure to spend wasn't his at all. It was borrowed, absorbed from the environment. Wearing the clothes of good judgment and reasonable reward, he returned it. So, what does this mean practically? Not a list. A principle. The window between when your income rises and when your expenses catch up is the most financially significant window of your adult life. It is not wide. Perhaps 6 months before the new normal has settled, before the social comparisons have recalibrated, before the Diderot cascade has reached its conclusion, and the old baseline has disappeared from emotional memory. Inside that window, you have something genuinely rare, a gap. Real, tangible distance between what you earn and what you require. That gap will not stay open by accident. It closes steadily through the combined force of social comparison and the coherence instinct, unless you make a deliberate decision, made clearly, made early, to hold it open. Not through austerity, not by becoming someone who refuses to live, but enough. Enough that your life does not become entirely hostage to its own current expenses. Enough that the option Tunde chose last year remains available to you. Whenever you are ready to reach for it, the architecture matters more than the amount. An automatic transfer of $200 a month is worth more, behaviorally, than an intention to save $600. Intention lives in the part of your mind that loses the argument. Automation lives somewhere. The comparison drive cannot easily reach. Tunde didn't have a larger raise than Amir. He had 60 days and the presence of mind to use them honestly. That is the whole difference. 9 years of compounding, financial and personal, sitting on 60 days of paying attention to what was actually driving him. Amir, for what it's worth, is not defeated by this. He told me once, in the way people tell you true things when they're not performing anything, that he wishes someone had named the Diderot effect for him in those first weeks after the raise arrived. Not to stop him spending. He doesn't regret the life, but he wishes he had seen the mechanism for what it was. A cascade. A current. Something with a name. Something that required a conscious act to interrupt, rather than simply a test of character he hadn't known he was sitting. He is making different decisions now. Slower ones. He has built some of the architecture, late, and he says it already feels different. Not depriving. Not small. deliberate, like the choices belong to him in a way they didn't quite before. That is the word he used, deliberate. It is, I think, one of the most underrated words in the entire conversation about money. Not optimized, not maximized, not even disciplined, deliberate, chosen, made from the inside outward rather than shaped by the current of comparison and coherence, and the cascade of things that each make sense individually, until the moment you see them as a system. The goal was never the number. The goal was always what the number was supposed to make possible. Somewhere, in the life that exists on the other side of your next raise, there is a version of your future with more space in it. Not more things, more room, more mornings that belong to you, more decisions that you have actually made, rather than decisions that were made for you by comparison and coherence, and the quiet, relentless logic of keeping up. More of the distance that turns a salary into freedom, rather than just a higher floor. That version doesn't require sacrifice that looks heroic from the outside. It requires 60 days. It requires a log, even a rough one, even in the Notes app on your phone, of what is actually driving the urge to spend. It requires one act of advanced architecture, made before the cascade starts, before the dressing gown arrives, and the study begins to look wrong. Amir's father had a phrase, "Don't let your outside grow faster than your inside." Amir understood it as a child. There are days now when he thinks about it differently. Not as a warning about vanity or appearance, as a precise, almost technical, description of exactly how this works. The outside grows faster, almost always, unless you decide deliberately before the window closes that it won't. If something in this shifted the way you see what happens after your next raise, stay with me, because what we're going to look at next surprised even me. Why the way your parents handled money. Not the lessons they gave you, but the silences, the tensions, the things that were never said directly at the dinner table, is still making financial decisions on your behalf right now. The research is unsettling, and the pattern, once you see it, is almost impossible to unsee.